It's wonderful to be here. Scattered applause, thank you. And I'm really excited to discuss with you one of my passions, which is really understanding what the future of health looks like and trying to incorporate not only data, but humanism as well. So trying to figure out how do we incorporate the patient into a lot of this stuff. My talk is called The Future of Data, Humanism, and Health, and I titled it from a physician's perspective. And the reason that I titled it from a physician's perspective is really because we have a really unique lens to look at data. Whenever we see a patient, we're actually collecting data. Whenever there's a laboratory value, we recognize that it's a value from somebody's own blood, that we had to stick them, that it's a part of somebody's physiology. And I like to start out my talks with a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. He was a Buddhist monk, recently died unfortunately, but he said, if you look deeply into the palm of your hand, you'll see your parents and all generations of your ancestors. All of them are alive in this moment. Each is present in your body. You're a continuation of each of these people. And what I really love about this quote is it starts to get into prediction. It says, right here, where we are right now, we're the continuation of all of our ancestors. He was actually talking about a relative that had died and trying to console somebody. And he said, if you look inside of yourself, you can see your parents. You can see all of your ancestors. And really what I find so amazing about genomics is that we can actually see the future too. We know if we have a child and we have another partner that has similar physiology to us or phenotypes, that child will actually share some of those traits too. And so it's kind of amazing that the human body contains so much prediction from the beginning. So why does health data matter? Well, in 2043, the economy is actually going to be $100 trillion bigger than it is today. And most of these gains are actually going to be in the healthcare sector. Healthcare is expected to represent about probably 10 to 20% of some of those gains in the future. So it's a really, really important sector to start to examine. The other really surprising fact to me that I learned a couple years ago was, well, health data is actually expected to double every 73 days. And a lot of this is actually from Internet of Things. It's from all of the data, all of the sensors that we're collecting. But what's so amazing is that the health data that we have right now will be far surpassed by the health data that's coming even in the next half a year, in the next year. So this is an example of where some of that health data is actually coming from. In the background is Project Baseline by Verily. So this is a Google initiative where they're actually collecting so much data from people and in a way that's never been collected before. We're collecting it longitudinally, and we're basically taking samples of lab values, so blood samples. We're taking values of ocular exams, even of microbiome and stool samples, as well as physiologic samples, and collecting that every 3 to 6 months over the span of 5 to 10 years, which has never been done before. The next is the Apple Iwatch, which you're all familiar with, but when you really think about what it is, it's a watch that's sitting on your wrist, and it's a microcomputer, and it's able to actually very accurately look at your electrical signals from your body and thereby be able to predict if you're having a stroke or if you're having a heart attack, and potentially in the future if you're going to have a stroke if you go into atrial fibrillation. The last one is a company that was really interesting to me. It was founded by a Singularity University graduate, but it's called Clinic AI, and what they're doing is they're actually taking stool samples from whenever somebody goes to the bathroom to get a better sense of people's microbiomes. So really to be able to predict if you're going to have colorectal cancer in the future, or potentially if you have any kind of big problems with your metabolism. Finally, this is a source of data that is really accelerating and is going to be a source of really interesting discoveries. But it's genomic data. Really, there's a huge market for direct-to-consumer sequencing of genes, and it's only expected to grow. One of the really interesting things to me about the paradigms within medicine right now is that before, all of the data, all of the information was in the hands of providers and in the hands of health systems. And now we're moving into a new era where a lot of that data is actually in the hands of patients. But we don't quite know what to do with it. We don't quite know how to help patients yet to figure out what's going on in their own bodies. And that's the goal of this next phase of medicine, as well as my company, LUMAS Health, which is basically to say, well, if all the data is in the hands of the consumers, how do we actually personalize this? How do we deliver this information to patients in ways that they can understand, in ways that they can use? And that is going to be one of the challenges. So how many here have heard that data is gold? So I always hear that. It kind of annoys me because really, when you're a data scientist, you realize data in and of itself is not gold. Data is gold ore. It takes a lot of steps to be able to make something that's unstructured into something that's meaningful and something that can actually influence people's lives. And so when I think about prediction, the thing that I think is so important is for people to recognize that all of this data that's coming in doesn't necessarily add value. We really need to add value by starting to make really good algorithms, by starting to understand this data in meaningful ways that can impact people's lives. In my own career, I'm a cardiologist and a bioinformaticist, and I've always used an open source database, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. I encourage all of you guys to check it out. It's administered by the Centers for Disease Control, but they were actually really revolutionary because what they did was they took a really high quality sample of patients' data, and they would take physiology, laboratory, physical examination, and some history, and basically collect a lot of data points on one patient. But then they made it open source, so anybody could actually analyze the database, and they linked it to mortality. And we were able to find some really interesting insights from the database. We were able to show that there was an association between inflammatory markers in men, but not in females. And we were also able to answer a really simple question, which was, do you need to fast before you get your lipid exam? So how many of you here have gotten your blood cholesterol checked? Hopefully everybody, because I'm a cardiologist, so I would encourage you to if you have not. And how many of you here have been told that you need to fast before your test? So almost everybody. Our question was really, is that necessary? What's the data behind that? And there wasn't actually good data that argued that you need to fast. And so we used NHANES to actually answer that question and propensity score matched people if they were fasting versus not, and looked at whether there was an association with mortality, and we didn't find one. And that paper actually became the basis of national and international guidelines on this subject. So it was really exciting to see how something that's accessible to everybody, that you can really just access in the privacy of your own home, can actually become something that can change guidelines, can really influence people's care. So I wanted to go through a case study because this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's one of the reasons that I actually started going down a path of trying to disseminate some of the things that I was seeing in medicine rather than just try and study and research them. Because there's so many potential areas in medicine that we can improve with data, that we can improve with AI, but there's also so many risks and things that we need to take into consideration. So this case study is centered around heart transplantation. So I'm sorry for all of you that ate breakfast and that are not physicians. To me, this is kind of standard, but it's a photo of somebody getting a heart transplant. So they're actually dissecting away all the viscera, and they're about to cut that person's heart out because that person has died. And what we do is we actually put that heart into somebody that needs it, into somebody that's dying of heart failure. And this is an example of why we do this. So basically, the bottom curve is one that just shows what your survival is expected to be if you're just on optimal medical therapy alone. So there's an 8% survival rate after 24 months. With heart transplant, we have an 84% survival rate after 24 months. So really, this is a life-saving therapy for many of our patients. But one of the really interesting things, and the reason why I think data is a really interesting tool that we can use is, well, there's 5.7 million heart failure patients in the United States. Can anybody guess how many hearts we actually have? Just shout something out. Wow, that's ambitious. We actually only have 2,000 hearts available. So it's a very, very limited resource. And right now we have other means of kind of saving people's lives. We have these machines called LVADs, but they're difficult because you need to be plugged into the wall when you sleep. You can never go into water. So really, transplant is kind of the mainstay. But you can imagine that everybody wants a transplant. It's such a kind of limited resource that we have. So really, how do we decide who gets the transplant? How do we decide who's going to do well? So in thinking about this, I wanted you all to just get together with the people at your table, and I want you to create an algorithm if you were the doctor and trying to decide who is going to die, basically, of their heart failure or not, and create an algorithm to predict death. And you can choose out of these 5: age, race, sex, socioeconomic status, and weight. And I want you to decide what the top 3 predictors of mortality are in your model. So please go. All right, time is up. So how many of you guys chose age? I hope everybody, because if you're 90, you are much more likely to die than if you're 30. How many of you chose race? Okay, how many of you chose sex? How about socioeconomic status? And how about weight? Interesting. So this is why data-driven approaches are important. So this is showing age, so we all kind of know that if you're over 65, much more likely to die. This is by race, but the really interesting thing, this is all from NHANES, the database that I was mentioning, and it was linked to mortality. So this is actual data from the United States, and this is the database we use to actually do all the surveillance for epidemiology in the country. So it's a very high-quality database. But really, when it's just an unadjusted curve, it looks like if you're non-Hispanic white, you have a much higher association with mortality, but we'll get into that in a little bit. If you're male, you're more likely to die. Also, if you're overweight, if you're unadjusted. Socioeconomic status, interestingly, not highly associated when it's unadjusted. But this is, especially to non-data scientists, kind of the slide that I like to really emphasize, which is when we're building these models, if we just look at the story and we look at it very unadjustedly, I could say, well, it looks like white people are more likely to die in the United States, or if you're white. Or I could say, you know, if your socioeconomic status is below the poverty line, you're less likely, or you're just the same as likely to die as somebody that is above the poverty line. But really, when we start to adjust for these other variables, we see, well, if you're white, you're actually, you have the same association with death as if you're black when adjusted for things like age, socioeconomic status, sex, waist circumference. And so really, it's likely that the people that are white in our sample were a little bit older, and that's why they were likely to die. The interesting thing in NHANES, too, is, well, if your waist circumference is larger, if you're overweight, you're actually less likely to die than if you're skinny. And this is actually called the Obesity Paradox. In a lot of our epidemiologic studies, we actually find that people that are overweight but not obese tend to live longer. And it's really interesting because if we were only totally focused on the data, if we were only being totally data-driven, we would potentially say erroneous things to patients. We would say, well, you shouldn't exercise. You should eat as much fats as possible. And we know that's not also optimal. So really having a degree of oversight over this, really having experts that can understand what things make sense within our data, but what things we might need to examine and really dig into more is important. So this is also a view that I often have. It's of a room of heart failure specialists. So this was the HFSA meeting. But when you look at it, can you notice people that might be missing from this room? Because I certainly can as a female and as an Asian female. And what's really interesting is, well, how do your biases shape our future? So when we think about transplantation, one of the things is that you can imagine if there's a very limited resource, you kind of want to save the people that you can relate to. Because we really decide as people who gets these hearts. We really decide in a group, is this person going to live or is this person potentially going to die? And one of the difficulties is that some of us don't always know, or all of us don't know what our own biases are. So it's just really important when we're designing our algorithms to keep in mind how what we include or what we choose to not include in our algorithms influence the results that we have, influence the stories that we can tell. And so this is basically a really busy slide, but all this is showing is how we decide then, after we decide that somebody is going to get a transplant, to basically give them the heart. So somebody waits on a balloon pump, which is a machine in your leg that helps your blood move forward. They may wait with inotropes, which are IV medications, but you basically have a catheter in your neck for weeks to months, and you're waiting in the hospital. And when you look at this, it's really interesting because even though we're so sophisticated in data science and in medicine, really the way that we decide if somebody should get a heart, which is how sick they are, is based on just line listings. It's not based on any kind of data science. We're not using any kind of algorithms to say this person is the sickest and they're crashing and they need a heart. We're really doing it by, well, do they have a line in their neck? You know, did we put some kind of support in their leg to help their heart pump a little bit harder? And to me, this is really an opportunity within AI and within data science to start to use evidence-based approaches that are built on data science to decide, do we need to really start to intervene early on this person, or is it okay to let them wait? The other issue kind of within data science and within heart failure is when we start to build these algorithms, say that we create an amazing AI algorithm that can then predict this person is going to crash, they need a heart at this moment. Well, when we do that, are we really favoring certain people with our algorithms and in ways that we can't always be able to understand? When you're in a room with a lot of people that have very similar views, you can kind of start to tell what the biases are because you know these people and you can examine biases and talk about them. It becomes a lot more difficult when we start to put these into algorithms. And especially if you can imagine, we're basically taking data sets that have already had our bias, that have already had the biases of who's going to live or who's going to die, that's been basically curated and picked by people, and then we're trying to apply them to the future, and we're using basically those values to then have to decide, well, you know, how do we build our next algorithms? So this is really a picture that shows what the mortality outcomes are for males and females. And when you look at it, you can really notice that there's a clear separation between who lived and who died for males and females. And one of the difficult things is we actually don't know why this exists. And as we move into kind of more sophisticated data science, and as we move into potentially more black box algorithms, it becomes harder and harder to actually understand, well, why was this separation? What actually happened where males had a much higher survival rate? The other portion of bias is really what we already have kind of seen within the hospital, which there's certain races that are less likely to get optimal care. This is a study in JACC, and it was basically showing that African Americans were less likely to receive a cardiologist referral if they were coming into the unit for heart failure. And that's really standard of care for us. If somebody's coming in, crashing and burning and potentially dying from heart failure, we want a specialist to be able to see them. And so when we look at in our data sets, especially who's survived and who hasn't survived, some of that may be due to our own bias that we already had in medicine. So the next part of heart transplant, let's say that you actually get the heart transplant, is basically the follow-up. So this is an example of what we actually do to patients after they get heart transplants. This is a small catheter within the heart that's transplanted. We have to take a little section of that heart. So we basically do a little biopsy, and then we examine that biopsy under a slide. And what we're actually looking for is any inflammatory markers. We're looking for if there's any rejection from that heart. And the reason that I bring this up is patients actually have to have this every week to start. So after you get a heart, you have to have a large needle that goes into your artery or vein, and then it goes basically up into your heart. And we have to biopsy that heart every week to start with, and then eventually every month, and then eventually every year. But it's a very, very invasive and intense procedure. And so this is actually one of the breakthroughs, I think, that's happened in heart transplant. And this is called the LUMAS test. But what it does is it actually substitutes that biopsy for a blood test, because you can imagine if your heart is rejecting, there's probably some markers, and especially gene expression profiles, that start to change in your blood. And so what the company did was they actually were able to measure in patients that were rejecting versus in patients that were not, whether those gene profiles were different. And they were able to develop a very sensitive test that was actually able to show that there was different profiles. And we use that in clinical practice to decide if somebody is rejecting or if they're not. And we're able to actually spare people then from these very highly invasive procedures, all on the basis of this one genetic expression test, which was developed with machine learning techniques. So when I think about data science, and I don't know if this is how you guys also think about it, but it occurred to me at one point that what we're really trying to understand, what we're really trying to do, is to take in all of these inputs. And in an ideal world, what we're ultimately trying to do is to take in all the inputs, but then to be able to say, well, what's going to happen? Can we actually predict the future? And what I find so interesting is there's so many ways that data science can help the world. There's so many ways that if we gather enough inputs, we can potentially start to develop more and more powerful algorithms. But really, if we're able to take all of these inputs, we really need to think about what we're actually taking and how we're actually designing these algorithms to actually get at the meaning that we're looking for. And when you think about it, we're really taking so many different things and putting them into a computer. But when we think about our own intuition, even when we think about our own empathy, as humans, we're able to predict already. My friend will do this. My partner, may think this if this arises. And really, how do we start to kind of model our own empathy? How do we model our own intuition? And how do we put that into an algorithm that can potentially influence outcomes? This is the other point that I thought was really important to make here, because so a lot of my research has started to deal with machine learning and has started to deal with explainable AI. And I, as a physician, am not a PhD, so I work with an MIT scientist named Cynthia Rudin, who's over at Duke and runs her prediction lab. But one of the things that we've started to really find with some of our data is that logistic regression is performing just as well as any of the other machine learning algorithms. And when we started to find this, I had initially asked her, this seems kind of ridiculous to me, like, is this known? I mean, this seems like something we need to publish immediately. And her response was, well, we've known this as data scientists forever, which I hadn't been aware of. But the next kind of question to me then is, well, if all of these algorithms are actually performing similarly, then especially within medicine, where we want everything to be transparent, where we want to be able to understand what is driving all of these predictors, then what's the role of machine learning? Do we need to go to black box models, or should we start taking a step back? Should we start making sure that we can validate these models with logistic regression first as a gold standard? And this is really our own data. We were looking at metabolic syndrome, which is a combination or a constellation of traits like your weight, your triglycerides, your HDL, if you're hypertensive, and if you have prediabetes. And we compared them using a variety of machine learning methods and found that logistic regression was performing almost as well. And this is in a data set that only has 2,000 patients. This is in a data set where we already had clinically curated our variables, so we weren't trying to extract different features, and we were using oversight. But one of the, I would say, things that made me a lot more confident within our approaches in medicine was, well, we've been using linear and logistic regression for quite a while, and it seems like these approaches are actually sufficient for now. And I would just encourage a lot of you, as you build your own algorithms, to always validate that you need to build a really sophisticated or a complicated model, and that a much simpler one isn't just as appropriate. And this is the ROC curves. So one of the other things that I've heard a lot is, well, more data is better. We can always just throw all of this data into database, and then we're going to run a really sophisticated algorithm, and then we're going to get a better result. So does more data equal more health? Well, kind of depends. This is a photo of prostate cancer incidence as well as a trend of death. And can anyone guess why around the 90s the incidence of prostate cancer just totally skyrocketed? Yes. So the PSA was developed, and PSA is a really amazing test. We can really be able to detect prostate cancer very, very early. But if you notice, the mortality line is pretty flat, and that's because, well, even though we can detect it early, so what? Most people actually die of other things rather than prostate cancer. And this is a graph that's actually showing, with PSA screening, what actually happens to patients. So out of the people that are diagnosed, many of them will actually be overdiagnosed. Many of them will be subjected to tests where you have to get a biopsy of your prostate, where you might have to get your prostate removed. And so really, when we think about what's important, if we should be doing a lot of testing, how much data we need to be collecting, we also need to think about what the results may be of collecting that data, whether that's going to lead to problems in the future and potentially overdiagnosis, or if we can actually improve lives with it. This is a graph, and this is actually one of the biggest breakthroughs, I think, that's happened in medicine, and it, to me, is a result of a lot of different data converging. This is a PCSK9 inhibitor. So basically what that is we found some patients that had really, really high levels of cholesterol, and it seemed to run in the family. And basically we were able to sequence those genes, and we were able to say, well, are there certain genes that actually are causing this really elevated LDL? And we were able to find the gene that was, which is the LDL receptor, and we were able to make an antibody that targets that gene. So effectively, we were able to kind of knock that gene out from patients. And this is showing, the blue line is the placebo, so basically not taking a medication at all. The red line is with that medication. And you can see the LDL levels actually decrease from 90 to about 30 in patients, which is insane. And so what's interesting about this case study to me is it's really a story of multiple industries colliding. It's really an example in medicine of how we can start to take data. So we were able to take data that showed that these LDL levels were really, really high. And then we were able to use genomic sequencing, which used to cost billions of dollars and now only costs hundreds, to be able to find the causative gene. And then we were able to make medications out of it that actually really affected people's lives. And when you think about the life cycle of drugs, we're reaching a time when all of this stuff is really accelerating. We're able to sequence genes so much more rapidly. We're able to combine data in so many more ways that we can actually identify people that have pathologic issues going on. And we're able to start to automate some parts of the pharmaceutical process. So even though this process took 15 years to develop this drug, in the future you can imagine that we're going to reach a time where we can start to knock out certain genes that we don't want in patients. We can start to potentially add them with CRISPR. The last thing that I wanted to touch on is just really when we're deciding how to design for the future, what do we really need to think about? I put an example of pacemakers and biometric data in there because you can imagine as we develop more and more sensors, if you guys are running companies that are taking patient data, but then putting all of that data into silos, that data really isn't able to be combined. It's not able to be used in ways that can actually benefit humankind. So for me, one of the examples was pacemakers. And I had gone to see a patient in the middle of the night. They basically had thought that they got a shock from their ICD. And when I examined them, I found that they were totally fine, and I told them to go home. But what I realized was, this is ridiculous. How does the patient not know themselves if they got a shock from their own device? And I dug further and further into it and found that, well, that data isn't owned by the patient. That data is actually owned by the device company, and the device company doesn't even share it with health systems. Or they share it with one designated health system, but not all of them. And when I started to think about it, you can imagine how that actually stalls innovation. That patient had to drive 2 hours. They had to have a $500 ER visit rather than knowing themselves what happened in their own body. For me, I had to, as a physician, I had to stop taking care of the really sick patients to go and see this patient to tell them that they were fine. For the health system themselves, if that patient wasn't our patient, we wouldn't know whether or not that patient had gotten billed already for a pacemaker interrogation, and so we actually lose money because we can't see if that patient has gone to any other places. And then also, I can't even look at that patient's data. I don't know what changes have been made to their device, so I can't provide them as optimal care. And when you think about research as well, I can't combine that pacemaker data to the laboratory values we have in our EHR, to their genomics, to any of their physiologic data that might be collected from their Apple Iwatch or their Fitbit. And I can't develop better algorithms to use that electrical data to decide how somebody's going to do. And so just in thinking about what we're doing with our data, we need to keep it as open source as we can, even given the privacy regulations, because that'll really help us accelerate the type of algorithms that we're building. And you guys are all probably aware of this, but to me as a clinician, this is concerning. With companies like 23andMe that are really marketing all of these things to consumers, there's a huge question of, well, whose data is that? And it's not really the patient's. A lot of the companies sell that data. But I think it's really difficult because most consumers aren't aware of this. And so it's something that we really need to keep in the forefront of our minds is, well, what's our goal with this? Is our goal only to make money, or do we need to start to design systems where we're actually trying to improve human health and humankind? The last thing that I wanted to touch on was the COMPASS algorithm. How many of you have heard of COMPASS in the past? So it's basically an algorithm that helps judges in rural areas predict recidivism. So it's a black box algorithm, it's proprietary, and if you're basically a convict, you're sitting across from a judge who might have a black box that shows basically what the percentage is that they predict that you will go back to jail, or that you will commit another crime that takes you back to jail. And so it's used as a decision tool by judges to decide if somebody is at high risk for going back to jail. And the argument is, well, it's probably less biased than these rural judges, so it's appropriate to have this as a decision tool. But one of the difficult things is it's proprietary. So it's really difficult to understand how this was designed. It's really difficult to see what biases might be present in an algorithm that's being deployed across the country, and that's influencing people's fates. And the reason that it's so interesting to me as a physician is a lot of these things are starting to be applied within the healthcare system. We're starting to use black box models to basically decide, well, should we allocate resources? Should we allocate time to this patient? Is this patient at risk for dying? But we can't always validate these things. And so really, one of the things that I wanted to leave everybody with as well, and this is, to me, the most important part of this talk, is really what ultimately are we optimizing? This is a view that I see quite often. It's somebody in the ICU, and in this case, we've decided to optimize their length of life. But one of the things that, as a physician, I believe that we need to start moving towards is to understand, well, is life really just length of life, or does it mean something else for these patients? when you're sitting across from somebody, you can do a much better job of teasing that out. So as a physician, that is my job, to say, well, do you consider life just the amount of time you're on the earth, or do you consider life being able to meaningfully interact with people? Do you consider life to be fed through a tube, or do you consider it to be completely untethered from machines? And in a lot of our algorithms right now, we optimize to finances, to basically the length of life or mortality. But really, how can we get to some of the more granular things that people really value? How can we decide, or how can we help people decide what the right approach is for them, and understand what their values actually are? So the major takeaways from this talk are really, data is only gold if we can use it to generate insights. So I just urge you, especially at this juncture, to share your data if you can. All algorithms have the bias of their creators and their populations. Transparency is very important. And really, from the beginning, we need to start deciding what we're optimizing and deciding how to really impact people's lives in a way that's meaningful for them. Thank you. And then one other comment. So you guys should definitely contact me. What we're doing right now with NHANES is we're starting to use logistic regression to build really good models, as I mentioned, but we're also using explainable AI. So if any of you are interested, I'd be really curious to see what kind of algorithms you can build from our data and to compare them to what we're actually building. And the other component of this is we'd like to validate on a data set that has the same variables and very similar people, but is a different population, I would say. So please reach out to me.